The air tasted of ozone and wet asphalt, a sharp, metallic tang that cut through the heavy storm. I had come to these woods seeking the kind of silence you can't find in the city, the kind that lets you think clearly about blueprints and load-bearing walls. Instead, I found absolute chaos. She was slumped against the twisted metal of the guardrail, the rain plastering her uniform to her skin. A state trooper, broken and bleeding in the mud. I stood there for a heartbeat, the engine of my truck idling behind me, caught between the instinct to drive away and the sudden, undeniable pull to step into the wreckage. I couldn't leave her to the storm. The physics of moving a body are deceptive. It isn't just dead weight. It is a shifting, unpredictable mass that refuses to cooperate with gravity. Dragging her up the ravine was a struggle against the mud that tried to swallow us both. Her utility belt, heavy with the steel and leather of her authority, dug sharply into my ribs with every step. I am an architect. My life is defined by load-bearing walls, by the precise calculation of stress and tension. I know exactly how much weight a structure can hold before it buckles. But as I pulled her arm over my shoulder, feeling the heat of her blood soaking through my jacket, I realized I was dealing with a collapse I hadn't designed. She was heavy, solid in a way that spoke of muscle honed for confrontation. Yet now she hung against me with a terrifying fragility. I heaved her into the passenger seat of my truck, the effort leaving my own breath ragged. The storm hammered against the metal roof, sealing us in. As I drove, the silence of the cabin was replaced by the sound of her breathing, shallow, wet, and uneven. It was a broken rhythm that grated against my need for order. I drove with white-knuckled focus, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the deluge, while she slumped against the door, her head rolling with every turn. In the lightning flashes, I saw the sharp line of her jaw, the way pain had tightened her features into a mask of endurance. My cabin was supposed to be a sanctuary. I designed it that way. Clean lines, glass walls facing the north woods, a space where the geometry of the architecture imposed a sense of control on the wildness outside. It smelled of raw cedar and the faint, crisp scent of drafting paper. It was a place for solitude, for the quiet contemplation of form and function. But as I pulled the truck up to the porch, I knew that version of the night was gone. Getting her inside was a messy, undignified affair. The wind tore at the door, blowing rain into the entryway as I half-carried, half-dragged her across the threshold. The intrusion was immediate and visceral. Mud from the ravine streaked the polished concrete floors. Her blood, dark and metallic, dripped onto the rug I had selected for its specific textural interplay with the firelight. The chaos of the crash had breached the perimeter. I laid her on the low leather sofa, the material groaning under the sudden weight. She was a discordant note in a perfectly composed room, a wreck of torn uniform and bruised skin amidst the carefully curated minimalism. I stood over her for a moment, my hands trembling slightly, not from exertion, but from the sudden, overwhelming proximity to something so raw. She let out a low sound, a whimper that she would likely have hated me for hearing, and turned her head into the cushion. The storm raged outside, pounding against the glass walls, but inside the air thickened, heavy with the scent of wet wool, copper, and the undeniable heat radiating from her body. I wasn't looking at a blueprint anymore. I was looking at a woman who had been broken open, and for the first time in years, I didn't know if I had the tools to fix the damage. I moved to the kitchen island, scrubbing my hands with the deliberate intensity of a surgeon, or an architect, before handling a pristine model. I needed to be steady. The panic that had flared in the truck was useless here. This was a restoration project now. I gathered what I had: gauze, antiseptic, clean towels, and a bottle of whiskey, because the painkillers in the cabinet were expired. When I returned to the sofa, she hadn't moved. The water dripping from her hair had formed a dark halo on the leather, a stain I would worry about later. The uniform was a fortress: heavy wool, stiff collar, the silver badge catching the firelight like an accusation. I had to dismantle it to reach the damage. My fingers felt clumsy against the wet fabric, struggling with buttons never designed to be undone by a stranger's hands. There was a strange, illicit weight to the act. I wasn't just undressing a woman. I was stripping away the state. I pulled the heavy belt free first, the leather creaking as the handcuffs and holster slid away, hitting the floor with a heavy, metallic thud. Without that weight, she looked smaller, younger. I peeled back the jacket. Her shirt underneath was soaked through, clinging to her ribs like a second skin. I had to cut it away. The scissors sheared through the cotton with a crisp sound that seemed too loud in the quiet room. And then there was just her. The bruise on her shoulder was already blooming, a dark violet galaxy spreading across pale skin. I pressed a warm towel against the cut on her forehead. She hissed, a sharp intake of breath through gritted teeth, her body arching instinctively against the pain. The heat coming off her was startling. It radiated against my palms, a feverish, living warmth that made the cold rain outside feel a world away. "Stay still," I murmured, though I wasn't sure if she could hear me. I worked with the precision I applied to my blueprints, cleaning the grit from her skin. The smell of copper and rain was overwhelming, mixing with the scent of the cedar logs burning in the fireplace. It was intimate in a way I hadn't prepared for. Touching her, the curve of her neck, the hollow of her throat where her pulse hammered a frantic rhythm, felt like crossing a line I had drawn years ago. I designed spaces to govern movement, to keep flow predictable. But there was nothing predictable about the way my own heart kicked against my ribs when her hand blindly sought mine, her fingers gripping my wrist with desperate strength. Her eyes fluttered open, but they didn't find me. They were looking at something I couldn't see, glazed with shock and adrenaline. "The files," she rasped. Her voice was a ruin, cracked and low. They ran me off." I paused, the antiseptic hovering over a scrape on her arm. "You crashed," I corrected gently. "The storm." She shook her head, a frantic, jerky motion that made her wince. "No, not the storm. The blue sedan. They want the evidence." Her grip on my wrist tightened until it hurt. "Don't let them in." The words hung in the air, heavy and jagged. They ran me off. I looked at the woman lying on my sofa. Rowan, the name tag said, and realized the walls of my sanctuary had been breached by something far more dangerous than mud. I had built this cabin to be a fortress of solitude, a place where the only complexities were structural. I spent my life calculating loads, ensuring that nothing ever collapsed. But looking at the fear etched into her unconscious face as she drifted back under, I realized I had just invited a landslide into my living room. The wind howled, slamming a branch against the roof. The lights flickered once, then steadied. We were sealed in. The road would be washed out by morning. The cabin felt different now. It was no longer a retreat. It was a bunker. I finished binding her shoulder, the white gauze stark against her skin. I pulled a heavy wool blanket over her, tucking it around her shoulders with a tenderness that felt foreign to my hands. I didn't go back to my drafting table. I couldn't. I poured 2 fingers of whiskey and sat in the armchair opposite her, watching the firelight play across her face. The silence returned, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was charged, waiting. I listened to the storm trying to tear the world down outside, and I watched the woman who had survived it. The shift happened the moment her eyes opened. 1 second, she was a broken thing shivering under my wool blanket, a collection of soft angles and pained breaths. The next, the steel slammed back into place. Her gaze didn't drift. It snapped to mine with the sharp, assessing clarity of a weapon being drawn. There was no confusion in her face, only a terrifying, immediate calculation of threat. She pushed herself upright, the blanket falling away to reveal the bandage on her shoulder and the dry t-shirt I had maneuvered her into while she slept. She ignored the pain that must have been screaming through her nerves. She was looking for her armor. "Where is it?" Her voice was raspier than before, stripped of any softness, demanding compliance. "Dried and folded on the chair," I said, my voice steady. I didn't move from the kitchen island where I was leaning, nursing a mug of black coffee. I kept my posture loose, non-threatening, but I watched her with the same intensity she turned on me. "Your belt is on the table." I unloaded the weapon, safety first. Her eyes narrowed, dark and dangerous. She didn't thank me. She looked at the gun, then at the door, then at me, triangulating the distance. You shouldn't have touched my gear. You shouldn't have bled on my rug, I countered, keeping the tone light but firm. But we work with the materials we're given. She flinched, not from the words, but from the sudden realization of her own physical state. She looked down at her hands, scraped raw, trembling slightly, despite her will to hold them still. The trooper, Rowan, was trying to pilot a body that had suffered a catastrophic structural failure. I watched the internal struggle, the way her jaw tightened as she tried to force her muscles to obey a command they couldn't execute. "I called it in?" she asked, though it sounded more like a challenge than a question. "No signal," I said, gesturing to the storm-lashed window. "And the landline has been down since the first tree fell. We're isolated, just the architecture and the elements." She swung her legs over the edge of the sofa. The movement cost her. Color drained from her face, leaving her gray and clammy. "I have to leave. You have a concussion and a laceration that needed stitches I didn't have," I said, stepping forward but stopping when she raised a hand. "You walk out that door, you faint in the mud in 50 yards. Hypothermia takes the rest." "You don't understand," she spat out, pushing herself to her feet. She swayed, a tower with a compromised foundation. "I can't be here." She took one step, then two. It was a study in pure, stubborn will overcoming physics. But gravity is patient. On the third step, her knee buckled. I moved before I thought about it, crossing the distance with a speed that surprised me, catching her just before she hit the floor. Her body was rigid against mine, resisting the support even as she relied on it. For a second, we were a tangle of limbs and heavy breathing, the scent of antiseptic and her own unique, musky warmth filling my senses. She shoved me away, stumbling back to the sofa, breathless and furious. She glared at me, humiliated by the betrayal of her own body. "I designed structures designed to withstand earthquakes, hurricanes, and time," I said softly, handing her the mug of coffee I had been holding. She took it, her fingers brushing mine, cold against hot. "I know how to spot a load-bearing wall that's about to shear. You're strong, Rowan, terrifyingly so. But even steel has a yield point." She looked up at me, the steam from the coffee curling between us. The anger in her eyes softened into something more complex. Suspicion mixed with a reluctant, grudging respect. She took a sip, closing her eyes as the heat hit her system. "You're an architect," she murmured, the fight draining out of her just enough to let her sit back against the cushions. "I am," I replied, leaning back against the heavy timber mantle of the fireplace, watching the firelight catch the sharp line of her cheekbone. And I have to say, I rarely see a fortress hold itself together with such elegant desperation. It's impressive. The compliment hung in the air, weighted and sultry. It wasn't about her looks, though she was striking in the way a storm front is striking. It was about her construction. She looked at me over the rim of the mug, and for the first time, the wall between us didn't feel like a barricade. It felt like a threshold. "I'm not staying long," she said, but the edge was gone. "I know," I answered, watching the way her throat moved as she swallowed the coffee. "But you're staying. For now." The cabin plunged into darkness, so sudden it felt like the world had blinked. Then the firelight took over, painting the room in shifting oranges and deep, wavering shadows. The hum of the refrigerator died, the electric buzz of the modern world silenced, leaving only the crackle of the cedar logs and the relentless drumming of the rain. It was an abrupt shift in scale. We weren't in a house anymore. We were in a cave, huddled against the dark. The space between us shrank. The shadows hid the corners of the room, forcing our attention solely on the illuminated circle of the hearth. And each other. Rowan didn't flinch when the lights died. She just stared into the flames, her profile sharp and unreadable. The silence stretched, heavy and thick. The kind of silence that demands to be filled with truth. "You said they earlier," I said quietly, my voice low to match the room. "When you were delirious. You said they ran you off the road." She went still. For a long moment, I thought she would retreat behind that shield of hers, the one made of badge numbers and procedural deflection. But the firelight softened the hard lines of her face, exposing the exhaustion underneath. She looked at me, and I saw the calculation happening behind her eyes. weighing the risk of silence against the weight of the secret she was carrying. It wasn't the storm, she admitted, her voice rough. The road was slick, sure, but I know how to drive in rain. I know every curve of Route 9. She shifted, wincing as the movement pulled at her stitches. It was a blue sedan, unmarked, but I knew the driver. I knew the dent in the bumper. I waited, letting the confession breathe. I didn't push. You don't push a wall that's already leaning. You let gravity do the work. I found the ledger, she continued, her gaze dropping to her hands. Civil asset forfeiture. Except the assets weren't being forfeited to the state. They were disappearing. Cash, drugs, weapons, a whole pipeline running through the precinct, protected by the very people supposed to stop it. She looked up then, and the fire in her eyes was brighter than the logs burning in the grate. I was supposed to look the other way. That's the protocol. You protect the Brotherhood. But I couldn't. I pulled the files. I was taking them to the DA in the city. And they knew, I said. It wasn't a question. They knew. They tried to pit me. At 60 miles an hour on a wet curve. They didn't want to stop me. They wanted to erase me. The gravity of it settled over us. She wasn't just a crash victim. She was a target. The men hunting her were the ones who would answer my 911 call, if the lines were working. She was entirely, terrifyingly alone. And by bringing her inside, by locking that door, I had placed myself directly in the crosshairs. Logic dictated I should be afraid. Self-preservation is a primal instinct, usually the loudest voice in the room. But as I watched her, battered, hunted, yet sitting there with her spine straight and her jaw set, I didn't feel fear. I felt a strange electric thrill. It was the thrill of seeing a structure that refused to collapse under impossible load. I realized then that I had been bored for years. Bored with safe designs, bored with predictable outcomes. This was complex. This was dangerous. You're safe here, I said, the promise slipping out before I weighed it. Until the storm breaks, you're a ghost. No tracks in this mud. I moved from the mantel then, crossing the rug to sit on the coffee table in front of her. I needed to check the dressing on her shoulder. That was the excuse, at least. I reached out, my fingers brushing the skin just above the bandage. She flinched, not from pain, but from the contact. I didn't pull back. Let me see, I murmured. I peeled back the edge of the tape. The wound was angry, but holding. My hand lingered on her arm, feeling the heat of her skin, the tension in the muscle. We were close now. Close enough that I could smell the rain that still clung to her hair, mixed with the wood smoke. The air between us changed, charged with something that had nothing to do with the storm outside. It was a magnetic pull, the inevitable result of two bodies occupying a space that had suddenly become too small for secrets. Her eyes locked on mine, wide and dark, searching for a reason to trust me, or perhaps a reason to run. I didn't give her either. I just held her gaze, steady and unflinching, letting the silence speak the things we weren't ready to say. The secret was out. The walls were down. And in the flickering light of the fire, the distance between the architect and the trooper collapsed completely. The air in the room had shifted density. It wasn't just the humidity of the storm anymore, or the lingering scent of damp wool. It was the pressure of two bodies occupying a space that had suddenly become too small for anything but the truth. My hand was still on her arm, resting just above the fresh bandage, but the medical necessity had evaporated minutes ago. What remained was a raw, unfiltered want that hummed between us like a live wire. She didn't pull away. Instead, she leaned into the touch, a microscopic movement that felt like a surrender. "You're staring," she said, her voice dropping an octave, losing that crisp, professional clip she used to keep the world at bay. "I'm assessing," I corrected, though my thumb traced a slow, deliberate line along the inside of her wrist. Her pulse was hammering against my skin, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. "You run on adrenaline, Rowan. Even sitting still, you're vibrating with it. It must be exhausting to be that alert, all the time." "It keeps me alive," she countered, though her eyes dropped to my mouth, a betrayal of her focus. "Better than hiding in a glass box in the woods, pretending the rest of the world doesn't exist." "I don't hide," I said, leaning in just an inch closer, daring her to retreat. "I curate. There's a difference. I choose what comes in. I choose what stays out. We were talking around it, dancing on the edge of the cliff. We discussed the architecture of our lives, my solitude, her cynicism. I told her about the fatigue of constant precision, of ensuring every line met perfectly, of the loneliness that settles into the bones when you realize you've designed a life so perfect no one else fits inside it. She spoke of the weight of the badge, the corrosion of seeing the worst in people day after day until you forgot what the best looked like. We were two women who had built fortresses around ourselves, realizing simultaneously that we had left the gates unlocked for the first time in years. "You think you can control this?" I whispered, the challenge hanging in the smoke-scented air. "You think if you categorize it, the storm, the crash, the adrenaline, you can file it away like evidence?" She looked at me, her pupils blown wide, swallowing the iris. The firelight caught the sweat on her brow, the tremor in her lip. "I know I can't," she admitted, the confession stripping away the last of her defenses. "That's what terrifies me." The challenge hung there, vibrating in the silence. I didn't wait for her to retreat. I reached up, my hand sliding into the damp tangle of her hair, guiding her. The first kiss wasn't tentative. It was a collision, a structural failure of every inhibition we had held on to. She tasted of the cheap whiskey I'd poured earlier and the sharp, clean scent of ozone. It was desperate, messy, and entirely perfect. Her hand, the one not injured, tangled in my shirt, pulling me closer with a strength that made me gasp. There was a distinct contrast in the touch that maddened me. Her hands were rough, calloused from the steering wheel, the grip of a service weapon, the unforgiving reality of her work. My hands were softer, accustomed to the smooth glide of graphite on vellum, the cool touch of marble samples. When she ran her thumb over my jaw, the friction was electric. It was the friction of different worlds grinding against each other, creating heat. We moved from the table to the thick rug before the fire, the transition seamless, driven by gravity and need. The firelight painted her skin in shades of amber and gold, softening the bruises, making the danger feel distant. This wasn't the frantic coupling of strangers trying to forget the cold. It was slow, deliberate. I traced the line of her throat, the curve of her collarbone, mapping her with the same obsession I gave my designs. She watched me, her gaze heavy and hooded, her breathing matching the rhythm of the storm outside. "You're not just a savior tonight," she murmured against my skin, her voice a vibration I felt in my chest. "No," I agreed, pressing a kiss to the pulse point under her ear. "I'm the complication." As we lay there, the fire dying down to embers, the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a temporary shelter. This wasn't just a night to survive the storm. I looked at the way her hand rested on my waist, possessive and sure, and I knew. The load-bearing walls of my life had shifted. I had spent years ensuring nothing could shake my foundation, only to find that I needed this earthquake. The morning light didn't break. It shattered. It came through the glass walls of the cabin in cold, gray sheets, stripping away the amber romance of the firelight and leaving only the stark reality of the day. I woke alone on the rug. The space beside me was cool to the touch, the warmth of her body, already a memory, fading into the weave of the wool. I sat up, pulling my robe tight against the chill that had seeped in through the drafty frames, and listened. The storm had exhausted itself. The silence that remained was heavy, wet, and absolute. I found her in the kitchen, standing in a shaft of pale light. She was putting her armor back on, and it was a painful thing to witness. The uniform, which had been a symbol of unassailable authority the night before, now looked like what it was: torn fabric and mud-stained wool. She struggled with the buttons of her shirt, her fingers stiff and clumsy from the cold or the pain in her shoulder. I watched her wince as she pulled the heavy utility belt around her waist, cinching it tight. It was a physical transformation. She was sealing herself back up, locking the woman who had unraveled in my arms behind a wall of state-issued gray. "You're leaving," I said. It wasn't a question. She froze, her hand hovering over the buckle of her holster, then turned. Her face was guarded again, the softness I had tasted gone. The bruises stood out starkly against her pale skin, violet maps of the violence she had survived. "The road is clear enough," she said, her voice raspy. She cleared her throat, trying to find her command tone. I have to get to the city. The district attorney's office opens in 2 hours. If I'm not there with the files, everything I did, everything I lost, was for nothing. I moved into the room, ignoring the instinct to cross the space and stop her. Let me drive you, I offered, leaning against the island, trying to project a calm I didn't feel. My truck is heavier. It's built for this terrain. Your car is a wreck, Rowan. You'll never make it out of the valley. She shook her head immediately, a sharp, decisive motion. No, they know my car. They're looking for a beat-up cruiser. If they see a civilian truck, they'll run the plates. They'll find you. She walked over to me, stopping just outside of touching distance. The air between us was still charged, but it felt brittle now, fragile under the weight of the daylight. I can't drag you into this. You have a life here, a structure. I'm not going to be the one who burns it down. I can handle a little fire, I argued, my voice tightening. I have resources. I have lawyers. I can help you navigate this. And I have a badge, she cut in, her eyes flashing. Even if it's tarnished. This is my mess, my evidence, my fight. She looked down at her hands, then back at me, her gaze softening for a fraction of a second. Last night, don't, I warned, stepping closer. Don't call it adrenaline. Don't diminish it to a side effect of the crash. I wasn't going to, she whispered. She reached out, her rough fingers grazing my cheek. A goodbye that felt like a theft. I was going to say that it makes the stakes higher. I can't stay, because I have something to lose now. She pulled her hand away and turned for the door. I watched her go, the frustration rising in my throat like bile. It was the architect's nightmare, watching a structure under extreme load, knowing you couldn't reinforce it. She paused at the threshold, the gray light framing her silhouette. If I make it, she said, not looking back, I'll come back. When, I corrected, fierce and desperate. When you make it. She didn't answer. She just opened the door and stepped out into the mud. I moved to the window, watching through the glass. Her car, the front bumper hanging loose and the sides scraped to raw metal, looked like a wounded animal huddled in the driveway. It coughed to life, a rough, sputtering sound that tore through the morning quiet. She didn't look up at the house. She backed out, tires spinning in the slurry of the driveway, fighting for traction. And then she was gone. The taillights vanished around the bend of the pines, swallowed by the mist. The silence rushed back in to fill the void she left, but it wasn't the peaceful silence I had come here for. It was hollow. It was the silence of a house that had suddenly become too big for one person. I looked at the unmade rug, the coffee cup on the table, the smear of dried mud near the door. My sanctuary was intact, but the fortification had failed. I was exposed. And as the sound of her engine faded completely, I realized I was standing in the wreckage of my own solitude, waiting for a collapse I couldn't prevent. The days that followed were a study in negative space. In architecture, negative space is what defines the structure, the void that gives the solid form meaning. It is the silence between the notes, the emptiness that allows the walls to exist. But in my cabin, the void was no longer an artistic choice. It was a suffocating, physical presence. The silence I had once cultivated like a rare orchid now felt heavy, pressing against my eardrums with the weight of deep water. I tried to return to my routine. I sat at my drafting table, the morning light hitting the vellum at the same perfect angle it always had, my graphite pencils sharpened to lethal points. But the lines I drew felt sterile. They were just geometry, devoid of life. I looked at the plans for a client's cantilevered deck and saw only the fragility of it, the arrogance of thinking we can suspend ourselves over a drop without eventually falling. I found myself pacing the perimeter of the main room, retracing the path she had taken, from the door to the sofa, from the sofa to the rug. The mud she had tracked in was gone, scrubbed away by my own hands in a fit of manic cleaning the hour after she left. I regretted that now. I had erased the only physical proof that she had been here, leaving myself with nothing but the ghost of a sensation, the roughness of her palm, the smell of rain and copper, the heat of her body shielding me from the cold. The cabin felt hollow. I realized that for years I had been designing spaces that were beautiful but uninhabitable, museums for a life I wasn't actually living. The isolation I had prized became a torture chamber. I drove into town just to get a signal, sitting in my truck outside the general store, refreshing the local news feed with obsessive, trembling fingers. I was looking for a headline that would end me. State trooper found dead. Corruption scandal turns violent. Officer missing. Every time the page loaded without her name, relief washed over me, followed instantly by a sickening wave of dread. The absence of news wasn't good news. It was just a prolongation of the suspense. I was living in the breath before the crash, waiting for the impact. By the fourth day, the silence had seeped into my bones. I stopped trying to work. I sat by the window where we had stood, watching the driveway. I realized that my previous solitude had been a facade, a load-bearing wall made of paper. I hadn't been strong. I had just been untested. Rowan had tested the structure, and now that she was gone, the roof was caving in. I wasn't an architect anymore. I was a squatter in my own home, waiting for the owner to return. I started sketching again, but not blueprints. I found myself drawing the curve of a jawline, the sharp angle of a shoulder, the chaotic, beautiful mess of a storm. I was designing a life that included friction, that included mud on the floor and danger at the door. I was designing a life that included her. It was a terrifying draft, full of structural risks I would never sign off on professionally. But it was the only thing that made sense. A week passed. 7 days of gray light and dead air. The hope I had been nursing began to curdle into a cold, hard despair. She wasn't coming back. The logic was irrefutable. If she had exposed the corruption, she was likely in protective custody, or moved to a new precinct, or worse. The worse was a dark room in my mind I refused to enter, but the door was always ajar. She was a woman who ran toward the fire. It was inevitable that eventually she would burn. I told myself to let it go, to accept that it was just a collision, 2 objects meeting in the dark and spinning away. Then, late in the afternoon on the 8th day, the sound cut through the quiet. It wasn't the wind, it wasn't the settling of the timber beams. It was the low, steady hum of an engine. My head snapped up. It wasn't the ragged, dying cough of her wrecked cruiser. This engine was smooth, powerful, climbing the grade of my driveway with a purposeful, mechanical growl. I stood up, my chair scraping violently against the floor, my heart hammering a rhythm that had nothing to do with architecture and everything to do with hope. I moved to the door, my hand hovering over the latch, terrified to open it, terrified that it might be anyone else in the world but her. The car that crested the hill wasn't a cruiser. It was a dark, nondescript sedan that stopped exactly where her wrecked patrol car had been. I stood on the porch, my breath caught in my throat, watching the door open. I had memorized the trooper's armor, the gray wool, the stiff collar, the heavy belt. But the woman who stepped out into the late afternoon sun was someone I hadn't met yet. She was wearing jeans and a dark sweater, her hair loose and softening her face, framing the jawline I had traced in the dark. The bruises had faded to yellow-green shadows. She didn't run to me. She walked up the gravel path with a steady, deliberate gait. She looked tired, a deep exhaustion in the slope of her shoulders, but she wasn't looking over her shoulder anymore. She was looking at me. Her gaze was heavy, direct, and stripped of the suspicion that had defined our first meeting. I walked down the steps to meet her on the bottom landing. "You're alive," I said. "I am," she answered, her voice smooth now, the rasp gone. "And I'm not running anymore." "What about the files?" "Delivered," she said, a small, grim smile touching her lips. "The squad is suspended. The investigation is wider than the county." She paused, looking down at her bare hands. "I'm on administrative leave. Indefinitely." "They took the badge, Rowan. They took the gun. I'm a civilian, pending review." She said it like she was confessing a sin, like the loss of the armor made her less than whole. But to me, standing in the golden light, she looked more substantial than she ever had in the uniform. "You kept your integrity," I said, closing the final distance. "The badge is just metal. You were the one who held the line." She looked up, searching my face. "I didn't know if the gate would still be open." "I never locked it," I told her. "I couldn't. I was afraid you wouldn't be able to get back in." The tension holding her upright snapped into relief. She let out a long breath. "It's a long drive back from the city," she murmured. I needed to see if the foundation was still here.
It is, I promised. Come inside. The cabin felt different as we walked in. The hollow echo that had plagued me for a week vanished the moment she crossed the threshold. The space filled up again, not with chaos or mud, but with presence. It felt like a home. I went to the cabinet and pulled down the whiskey. The same bottle, the same glasses. It felt like a ritual, a closing of the loop. I poured 2 fingers for each of us. She took the glass, her fingers brushing mine. The spark was still there, that sudden, sharp intake of breath, but the danger was gone. The air wasn't thick with the threat of gunmen. It was charged with something far more potent. Promise. To the wreckage, she said softly, raising the glass. To the rebuild, I corrected, clinking my glass against hers. The sound rang clear and true in the quiet room. We drank, the whiskey burning a familiar path down. She watched me over the rim of the glass, her eyes dark and heavy with unspoken things. I don't have a plan, she admitted, setting the glass down on the island. I've had a plan every day since I was 22. Wake up, put on the uniform, enforce the law. Now, I'm just Rowan. Rowan is enough, I said, moving around the island until I was standing in front of her. I placed my hands on her waist, feeling the warmth of her through the wool of her sweater. It was a solid, grounding heat. Rowan is exactly who I was waiting for. The sun was setting outside, casting long shadows through the trees, painting the room in the same amber hues as the firelight had, but without the flicker of fear. Inside, the light was warm and steady. I reached out and took her hand, the one not holding the drink, and laced my fingers through hers. It wasn't a desperate grip this time, born of adrenaline and survival. It was a secure connection, a joint, a bond designed to last. I'm not going anywhere tonight, she whispered, her thumb brushing the back of my hand, her eyes locked on mine with an intensity that made my knees weak. Good, I said, pulling her gently toward the living area, away from the door, away from the road that had tried to take her from me. Because I have some new designs I need you to see. They don't work without you. I don't know who I am without the weight of it, she admitted, her voice low. She was looking out at the darkening woods, her profile etched in the fading light. She wasn't talking about the physical weight of the belt anymore. She was talking about the identity that had defined her for a decade. I spent 10 years being trooper. I knew the rules. I knew where the lines were drawn. Without the badge, without the armor, I feel formless. I set my glass down on the drafting table with a deliberate click and moved to stand behind her. I didn't touch her yet, but I stepped close enough that the air between us compressed, charged with the heat of our bodies. I wanted her to feel the proximity, the undeniable reality of it. You're confusing the scaffolding with the building, Rowan, I said softly. The uniform was just the structure you used to hold yourself up while you were building the person inside. You don't need the scaffolding anymore. The foundation is set. It's solid. I've seen it take a direct hit and refuse to buckle. She turned in the circle of my presence, her back to the glass, her eyes searching mine. The vulnerability was there, naked and unflinching, but the fear that had driven her during the storm was gone. In its place was a raw, open curiosity. And what about us? She asked, her voice dropping to that register that vibrated in the center of my chest. 2 difficult, solitary women in a glass box in the middle of nowhere? That's a high-risk design. We both have sharp edges. High risk, high reward, I countered. I reached up, tracing the line of her jaw, feeling the tension melt away under my fingertips. Structure isn't about perfection, Rowan. It's about how the materials handle the stress. You and I, we fit. It's precise. It's durable. She didn't argue. She leaned into my hand, closing her eyes as if finally allowing herself to rest. Then build with me, she whispered. I'm tired of holding up the walls alone. The kiss was different this time. The first night had been a collision, a desperate, adrenaline-fueled attempt to survive the chaos. This was a claiming. It was slow, deep, and deliberate. My hands found the hem of her sweater, sliding underneath to find the warm, solid skin of her back. She made a low sound in her throat, her hands tangling in my hair, pulling me closer until there was no air left between us. We moved to the sofa, not with the frantic urgency of the crash,
but with the steady assurance of ownership. We lay there as the twilight deepened into true night, the cabin settling around us with familiar creaks and sighs. We talked quietly, mapping out the contours of a new life. We acknowledged the cracks, her trauma from the betrayal, the trust issues that came with the badge, my addiction to isolation, my tendency to prioritize control over connection. We didn't promise to fix them instantly. We promised to reinforce them. We agreed that we were load-bearing for each other now. "I'm not easy," she murmured against my neck, her breathing finally evening out into a peaceful rhythm. "I have ghosts. They might follow me here."
"I designed for ghosts," I promised, pressing a kiss to the pulse point of her shoulder.
"We'll make room for them. But they don't get the master bedroom. That's occupied."
We ended up by the window again, watching the night settle over the forest. The storm was gone, leaving the air clean and sharp. We stood side by side, her hand in mine, looking out at the darkness. It wasn't a void anymore. It was just the view from our home. Life rarely follows the blue lines we draw for it. Sometimes, the most enduring structures are the ones built from the wreckage of a collapse we never saw coming. We found that the things that break us are often the only things that create enough space for the light to get in. If you want to hear more stories about complex women finding sanctuary in the most unexpected places, subscribe and join us. We're just starting to build.